The world, by 1940, seemed to be plunging headlong into madness. It was shortly after the Second World War had begun, and across Europe, the German military machine was advancing with terrifying speed. Cities fell like dominoes, and the map of Europe seemed to redraw itself overnight in blood and fire. Yet, even in places far removed from the direct clash of armies, the tremors of war could be felt. Thousands of kilometers away in the quiet capital of Namibia, Windhoek, two German geologists, Heno and Herman, found themselves increasingly uneasy as they listened to the radio hum with news of the conflict. The reach of the war had extended far beyond the battlefields. German nationals in Africa were being arrested and thrown into internment camps under suspicion of being Nazi sympathizers. Neither Heno nor Herman had any interest in politics or warfare. They were scientists, men of the earth, whose lives were spent studying rocks, sand, and fossils. But to the authorities, nationality was reason enough for imprisonment. And now they knew, it was only a matter of time before their freedom would be taken too. One warm evening, the two men sat on the porch of their modest home, the fading light casting long shadows across the ground as they shared their growing concerns. There was a heavy silence between them before Herman broke it with a half-remembered joke. "You remember," he said almost to himself, "when we used to joke about hiding in the desert if a war ever broke out?" Heno turned to him startled. It was true. They had mentioned it in passing years ago, more as a fantasy than a plan. But now, with war knocking at their door, the idea no longer seemed far-fetched. The question lingered, could they actually do it? Could they disappear into the desert and survive for months, maybe years, until the war ended? Heno hesitated, then asked, "What about Otto?" His eyes drifted toward their loyal dog who lay quietly at their feet. Otto, sensing his name, perked up and wagged his tail. Herman smiled. "We take him," he said. "He's part of the team." The decision once made settled between them like a vow. The Namib desert, vast and merciless, would be their refuge. They wasted no time. Within 4 days they prepared everything they would need to survive. They gathered as many supplies as they could fit into their truck. Dried and canned food, tea, coffee, sugar, jam, and even a few small indulgences, chocolate and brandy to soothe the soul. Practical items followed: cooking gear, sleeping bags, a tarpaulin, clothing, sewing materials, and a first aid kit. They also made sure to pack fuel, tools, and spare parts for the truck. But the two most critical items were the radio and their guns. The radio, powered by the truck's battery, would be their only link to the outside world, a lifeline to let them know when it might be safe to return. As for the guns, they weren't ideal. Rifles had been confiscated due to wartime restrictions, but a shotgun and a pistol were better than nothing. If they were to survive, hunting would be essential. When all was ready, they set off, choosing a route few others knew. Their destination was deep in the Namib desert, a place few dared to explore and fewer still understood. But Heno and Herman had spent years mapping its rock formations and dry riverbeds. If anyone could hide there, it was them. The Namib desert is a landscape of extremes. It stretches along Namibia's western coastline, where the Atlantic Ocean meets scorched earth. To the north lies the Skeleton Coast, a region so desolate it earned its name from the countless ships that wrecked there, leaving survivors to die slowly under the relentless sun, with no food or water in sight. In the interior, towering sand dunes shimmer in hues of deep rust and orange, beautiful yet utterly inhospitable. But hidden between the dunes are ancient canyons, rocky outcrops, and the occasional waterhole, fragile pockets of life in a land that resists it at every turn. Their journey took them along treacherous paths that only experienced eyes could follow. Eventually they reached the top of a remote formation, Kuzib Canyon. From above, the canyon spread out like a forgotten wound in the earth, filled with jagged rocks, steep cliffs, and winding gorges. Below, the canyon floor was sandy and still, untouched by human presence. Herman looked out over the desolation and said, "They won't find us here." The thought was both comforting and terrifying. They had escaped the war, but now they faced an entirely different kind of battle, one against the elements, against hunger, and against the slow erosion of the human spirit in isolation. There was no turning back. Leaving the truck hidden beneath an overhanging cliff, they began the descent into the canyon. They followed a faint zebra trail, searching for water and shelter. The dry riverbed offered little hope, but to their relief they found several waterholes. One even held carp, plump, wriggling fish that seemed like a gift from the earth itself. Herman knelt by the muddy water, carefully cupping his hands until he managed to catch one. It was their first fresh meal in the wild, and they cooked it over an open flame, eating in grateful silence as the desert wind whispered around them. As they explored deeper into the canyon, They came upon a natural rock shelter, an overhanging formation that offered protection from the harsh sun and wind. It wasn't much, but it could be home. Over the next 2 days they made countless trips back to the truck, hauling their supplies down into the canyon and storing them in their makeshift cave. They carefully concealed the vehicle to ensure it wouldn't be spotted from above. But despite their efforts, hunger was never far behind. Their daily rations were simple and unfulfilling: flour mixed with water and a single spoonful of jam. It wasn't enough. Desperation forced them to seek other sources of food. Fishing, which had seemed so promising, yielded little beyond the initial carp. Their homemade wire hooks caught only frogs, and even those were rare. Their stomachs growled in protest. Hunting became the next option. On the way into the canyon they had noticed tracks, signs of wild cattle. A bull, a cow, and a calf. If they could bring one down they might eat well for weeks. They scouted the area and finally spotted the bull grazing at the canyon's base. The animal was massive and alert. A plan was quickly formed. Herman would take Otto and circle around with the shotgun to drive the bull toward Heno, who would wait in position with the pistol. Heno moved cautiously, keeping low and quiet as he tried to get into position. But the bull caught his scent and reacted instantly, charging at full speed. Heno fired the shotgun directly at the bull's face, but the pellets barely slowed it. At the last second he scrambled up onto a rocky ledge, narrowly avoiding being gored. From across the clearing Herman took aim and fired the pistol. The shot hit just behind the ear. The bull dropped. The bull sprang up again, bloodied but full of rage, a monstrous force refusing to surrender. Otto, their loyal dog, was the first to react. Barking ferociously, he lunged at the bull's face, biting and clawing at its snout with a courage that belied his size. But the bull, undeterred, tossed its head violently, flinging Otto aside like a rag doll. Herman raised his rifle and fired once more, this time aiming just behind the ear. The shot hit, and the beast collapsed again, but to their dismay, it rose once more, slower now, clearly weakening but still defiant, as if driven by the very spirit of the wild itself. They were out of bullets and utterly shaken by the ordeal. The sun burned overhead and silence followed, broken only by their heavy breathing and the distant rustle of wind across the arid terrain. Retreating to their cave in grim silence, the two men knew they had no choice but to finish what they had started. They gathered ropes, knives, and their sleeping bags, their faces drawn tight with fatigue and something darker, guilt perhaps, or the growing realization of how unprepared they truly were for survival in this brutal land. Back at the site they found the bull still alive, breathing heavily, its massive chest rising and falling. 2 more shots were fired, but again they failed to find the creature's heart, the sheer size of the animal rendering even that simple act maddeningly difficult. Inexperience clung to them like dust. Frustrated and ashamed, they finally devised a grim plan. With shaking hands they looped a rope around the bull's horns and secured it to a nearby tree, pinning the animal in place. Then, with a heavy heart and grim determination, one of them stepped forward and slit its throat. The act was not done out of malice but necessity, and it left them both shaken. But survival required sacrifice. That night, beneath the vast sky littered with stars, they roasted fresh meat over an open flame, the first real meal they'd had in days. It should have been a moment of triumph, but it felt hollow. The bull's death had been messy, painful, and personal. The next challenge was preserving what was left of the carcass. In the searing desert heat, they knew they had only a narrow window before the meat spoiled. Working with painstaking care, they carved the animal into strips. Some they dried into biltong, others they smoked slowly over a low fire. The process was rough and riddled with trial and error, but eventually they managed to secure a food supply. 4 days that turned into weeks, they lived on nothing but wild bull, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was sustenance, but it quickly became monotonous and joyless. Still, the experience marked their first harsh encounter with the brutal realities of wilderness survival. Gone were any romantic notions of hunting. In their place stood exhaustion, regret, and the harsh understanding that survival left no room for mercy. Their limited resources became an even greater burden. Often their bullets did not kill cleanly. Instead, they left animals injured, forcing the men to follow blood trails for hours or even days. Sometimes the prey escaped entirely, lost in the endless canyons. Other times they found the creatures only after they'd collapsed from exhaustion, still alive, still suffering. A quick, humane kill was a luxury they could not afford. Ammunition was precious and each shot had to count. The grim efficiency of the desert did not permit kindness. The monotony of their meat-heavy diet began to take its toll. Driven by desperation for variety, they devised a crude but clever solution to catch fish. Using tamarisk branches and pairs of their underpants, they fashioned a makeshift net, which they dragged together through the shallow waters of a dwindling water hole. To their delight it worked. For a brief time they feasted on carp, relishing the change in flavor and texture. But even this temporary reprieve was stolen from them. One morning they noticed strange footprints around the pond. Their fish were vanishing overnight. It didn't take long to identify the thief. The prints belonged to a hyena, an unseen predator that visited under cover of darkness. Furious, Heno made a declaration: "I'm not letting him steal our fish. I'll shoot him." Herman warned him off: "You won't get close enough. He'll smell you coming. And shooting in the dark? You'd waste a bullet." But Heno was resolute. He dragged his sleeping bag down to the water hole and spent the night on watch. Nothing came. The next morning he returned to the cave empty-handed, greeted by Herman's teasing smile and a hot cup of coffee. Undeterred and quietly stewing in annoyance, Heno returned to his post the following night. This time he heard it, the eerie, bone-chilling howl of the hyena. He gripped his shotgun and without a clear view fired blindly toward the sound. The haunting cries turned into a wounded yelp and then fell silent. Convinced he'd struck the creature, Heno rolled over and for the first time in days slept soundly. At dawn he followed a strange drag trail that wound away from the pond. Eventually, under the shade of an acacia tree, he found the hyena, paralyzed, its hind legs useless. Reluctant to use another bullet, he resorted to stoning the animal to death. It was a grim, protracted struggle, more harrowing than the bull's death. But at last the creature was still. Heno skinned the hyena and brought its pelt back to the cave. This time Herman did not mock him. As time dragged on, their surroundings shifted with the seasons. Days bled into weeks and weeks into months. The desert was an unforgiving teacher. The carp pond dried up entirely, stripping away another source of food. The relentless meat-only diet led to severe vitamin deficiencies. Their heads ached constantly, their energy drained. In desperation, they began to drink animal blood and consume raw meat, even fashioning crude sausages using the intestines and blood of a gemsbok. Their needs were primal now: food, water, salt. Every drop was vital. When their supplies ran dangerously low, they were forced to wander the desert in search of sustenance. Like the beasts that surrounded them, they became nomads. One searing afternoon, they sought refuge under a shaded rock face, a rare comfort in the brutal midday heat. The place was favored by wildlife and the ground teemed with sand ticks. As they rested, Herman winced and slapped his hand. "I think a tick bit me," he muttered. Moments later he began to sway. His face went pale and sweat poured from his skin. A strange rash spread rapidly across his body. "My head," he groaned before collapsing in the dust. Heno was seized by panic. Herman began to vomit violently, his condition deteriorating fast. Frantically, Heno searched the ground and found the culprit, a bloated sand tick, its body swollen with old, blackened blood. Realizing the danger, Heno acted without hesitation. He made an incision at the bite site and packed it with permanganate of potash, a crude antiseptic. It was a desperate gamble. Herman, now nearly blind and barely able to stand, leaned on Heno as they stumbled to a nearby cave. There they waited, hoping, praying. The next day Herman's fever broke. He could stand again if only just. The experience was a brutal reminder of how fragile their existence truly was. The months wore on. Drought stretched longer. The land became more barren. They moved from camp to camp, always chasing water. Sometimes the rains returned briefly, breathing life into the desert. Springbok herds would fill the plains, a breathtaking display of renewal. Amidst it all, their dog Otto remained steadfast. Despite being gored twice by a gemsbok, he never lost his hunting spirit. Like them, he had learned to endure. The desert was alive with quiet, resilient creatures. But the true test of endurance wasn't theirs, it belonged to the men who had chosen to survive in that vast, unforgiving expanse. As time wore on, the relentless demands of desert life began to break them down. The romantic idea of isolation faded quickly, replaced by the stark reality of hunger, fatigue, and an ever-dwindling supply of strength. Finding food had become a daily battle. Game grew scarce, water was even harder to come by, and the desert, once a place of refuge, began to feel more like a silent predator, watching, waiting for them to falter. By the time the second dry season arrived, their bodies were worn thin. Hunger gnawed at them day and night, turning even rest into torment. Muscles weakened, movements slowed, and every task, no matter how simple, became a challenge. It was during one of these desperate days that Heno spotted a flicker of movement among the rocks. A large lizard was scrambling for cover, its tail the last thing visible before disappearing into a crevice. Driven by sheer survival instinct, Heno sprang forward, grabbing the creature by the tail and pulling with all the strength he had left. Miraculously, he succeeded. Later, he would recall how the meat was white and firm, with a taste he described as somewhere between chicken and salmon. It wasn't a feast, but it was nourishment, and for a time it kept them alive. That lizard provided 2 small meals, a brief reprieve in an increasingly hopeless struggle. But the desert wasn't finished with them yet. Soon after, Herman began to complain of back pain. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the wear and tear of desert life. But the pain didn't go away. It worsened, spreading down his legs into his neck and through his head. His condition declined rapidly. Days passed and his strength vanished. He could no longer move with ease, soon he could hardly move at all. Hunting, gathering, even sitting upright became impossible. Heno, now burdened with both their survival, refused to give up. He hunted alone, dragging back whatever small game he could find and feeding Herman with whatever nature offered, even raw meat. But no matter how hard he tried, nothing improved. It was becoming terrifyingly clear that Herman wasn't going to recover without proper medical attention. With no other choice left, Heno made the painful decision to break their isolation. He packed up their old, weather-beaten truck, helped Herman inside, and began the long and dangerous journey back to civilization. The terrain was unforgiving: sharp rocks, dry riverbeds, steep hills, and the ever-present heat, but eventually they reached Windhoek. There, Heno delivered Herman into the care of medical professionals, hoping that something could be done. He didn't linger. While the desert had taken so much from them, it had also become home, strange as that might seem, and Heno wasn't ready to abandon it just yet. He returned to the wilderness with Otto, still seeking freedom in the only place he knew. But their secret had been exposed. Back in town, Herman, weakened and surrounded by familiar voices, was persuaded by friends to reveal Heno's location. Soon afterward, authorities moved in and apprehended him. Both men were briefly jailed, but their story, an astonishing tale of survival against all odds, quickly emerged. Recognizing that they were not dangerous fugitives, but men who had lived through a harrowing ordeal, the authorities transferred them to a hospital. Their doctors diagnosed Herman with a severe vitamin B deficiency, the root cause of his suffering in the desert. With treatment, he began to recover. When they were finally brought to trial, the charges against them were relatively minor: desertion, failure to register a dog license, infractions that paled in comparison to the scale of their experience. The courtroom was no longer a place of judgment, but one of reluctant admiration. These were not criminals, but survivors, men who had endured the unendurable. As such, the court showed mercy. Their punishment was reduced to a light fine, and with that, their legal troubles came to an end. But survival had left its mark, and life after the desert would be far from easy. Herman, though fully recovered from his illness, would meet a tragic end just a few years later, dying in a car accident in 1946. Otto, their quiet companion who had shared every hardship, disappeared mysteriously a few years later. No one knows what happened to him. As for Heno Martin, he chose to remain in Namibia, tethered both physically and emotionally to the landscape that had tested and shaped him. In time, he chronicled their extraordinary journey in a memoir titled The Sheltering Desert, a book that captured the raw intensity of their 2.5-year struggle. It remains one of the most powerful accounts of endurance and self-reliance in the face of overwhelming adversity. Stories like this remind us that survival isn't always about strength, it's about will, sacrifice, and the quiet, unwavering decision to continue, even when every instinct tells you to give up. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I share more real-life tales of adventure, survival, and forgotten history. And now, I want to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in their place? Do you think you could survive alone in the desert for 2.5 years? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.